that's why I want to ask you. It seems to me, and please do, this is very sensitive, and I want you to know that I really do want you to tell me that I'm wrong and give me all the pushback in the world. But I want to be as honest as possible because I want to be able to have an open conversation in a safe space, as it were, the likes of which I think, one, I feel uncomfortable doing in a lot of other places because there isn't a trans voice present, and I don't feel comfortable, making the case for a group whose interests I'm not entirely aligned with. And two, because I'm often having a combative conversation with someone who I feel is not arguing in good faith and who frankly might harbor some personal animus against trans people. And it makes me not want to cede any ground at all, right? So this is a unique opportunity for me. And so I want to ask you about the sports stuff because it does feel like in the context of sports, we have decided that we are discriminating insofar as we don't let cis boys play on cis girls teams, and you sometimes vice versa, sometimes not. Sometimes it's just that there's a presumption that cis girls aren't going to be able to compete with cis boys, so they don't have to actually bar them from doing so. And that there is an acceptance that we've decided that because of the generalized differences between the strength, et cetera, of cis boys and cis girls, that we are going to have discriminate on the basis of sex. We are going to have this separation. So it does feel a little bit different than other kinds of contexts where we say, well, we just shouldn't discriminate. Discrimination as a principle is wrong. It's not what's going on. It's not what we should do. It's not what we should endorse. How do you address people's concerns? Do you think that there's anything in the way of a quote unquote legitimate concern for folks that say, well, Pee-wee sports, who cares? No one's very strong. We're not talking about Olympic athletes here. No one's getting hurt. There's co-ed teams when kids are little, all of that, who cares? But at a certain point, maybe at older ages and at places where there is real competition and scholarships and the like, that there is real reasons, a legitimate justification for wanting to have a segregation, as it were, that is based on something physical, somatic, and that there's a non-transphobic justification for people not wanting either they're one, not wanting trans women to compete in sports, or two, at least wanting there to be criteria that make it more equitable for cis women.
And it's interesting, and I've got a few things to say, but hearing you sort of pause on the whole segregation part of things, and I don't blame you for that at all. I think that we're having a discussion about this, and it's important to talk about. You're not the only one to have paused on that. In fact, recently, in 2019 to 2020, there was a big batch of emails that were released from the Alliance Defending Freedom when they were starting to draft these policies. And this made big news. I think Vice reported on it. They signed off all their emails with under his wings and stuff. It was like this religious crusade sort of thing. But in debating, in drafting the messaging for pushing these sports bans, somebody marked up that in the messaging that they would sell this as separate but equal and segregated sports. And one of the Alliance Defending Freedom lawyers pushed back saying, hold on, this messaging is really terrible. But to go on, there's a couple points that I would have to make about this. Number one is that the number of athletes that we're talking about here and the amount of time that we're spending focusing on them makes it so clear that this is such a red herring. Because
I know, of course.
In West Virginia right now, the ban, there are 3 athletes, 2 of them just graduated and went to college and left West Virginia. The entire Supreme Court case that just came in yesterday that basically said, West Virginia, you cannot continue your ban right now. It allows this young transgender athlete, this young trans girl to play. This entire emergency hearing where West Virginia is spending millions of dollars putting this case in front of the Supreme Court, using procedures that are meant for national security issues. This all hinged on a single one trans girl athlete in the state of West Virginia.
And wasn't it the same in Utah, that there was
5 transgender athletes in the state of Utah. In fact, there are more pages in the proposed regulation from the Biden administration. I think it's 120 pages in the regulation. Than there are active high school trans women athletes. and so I think making sure that we kind of think about that for a second And this isn't just like a gotcha sort of like red herring sort of, it's just a small number, so you shouldn't care. In fact, I would even go as far as to argue that if we're talking about like fairness in competition and fairness in scholarships, transgender people are dramatically underrepresented in scholarships and for sports. And so trans people aren't taking people's scholarships. They're not going out there and suddenly like finding themselves dominating the scholarship field. If anything, I mean, for you would expect about 100 times more scholarships for trans people than they actually have. In fact, the number of trans women with scholarships in college athletics, it's vanishingly small. Right now, and I watch this, I follow this for a living. I could name maybe two.
Yeah.
And so like putting all of this energy into like this idea that trans people have this sort of that they're dominating the field and that they have this massive unfair, advantage on everybody. There are so many things working against trans people that it's hard to compete. It's very hard to compete in a state.
I think that's kind of why though, Erin. I mean, that's kind of why, like, how does something go from a wedge issue? I don't want to say wedge, an issue that's very discreet, that affects very few people in the country, to a national issue. If people, I think if these conservative activists said, we don't want cis women to lose out on athletic scholarships because they're faced with unfair competition from people who either are inauthentically trans and doing it just to compete against women and get the money, or all of these are, or maybe they are authentically trans, but they haven't been in transition sufficiently so that they have an unfair advantage in terms of strength and testosterone levels, or, all the reasons. And the comeback were, well, I agree on principle that there are some cases where I could see that it was unfair, but it isn't really happening. So shoot your shot. Like in these very discrete instances, I would agree that it was unfair, but it's not really happening. So there's no real need to fight about this. Then I suspect the temperature of this wouldn't be quite where it is. But the response is, and I'm not like arguing against the response. I'm just trying to describe what it feels like has happened. The response is that because these arguments are being made in bad faith, which I think is true, because it's just the camel's nose under the tent and it's the beginning of a bunch of other types of legislation, which I hope we will talk about in a second, that there is that we shouldn't concede anything about there being any legitimacy to feelings that this could be one area where there is, I don't know, there are some there's some legitimate concerns about what it means for the competitive nature of women's sports. And, that's a choice. And I find myself having a very easy time pushing back and arguing about the ridiculousness of a lot of these laws. But it is a little harder to take the stance that there's like absolutely no there when it comes to the sports issue. And sometimes I wonder, and you tell me if I'm conceding too much here, if it wouldn't be better to say, okay, I'm not going to fight that fight. It's a very narrow, it very rarely ever comes up. If it's a direct scholarship issue, fine. And I'm not going to let you use that to deflect from all of the ways that trans people's rights are being substantively infringed upon over here with all of these other laws. Do you think, what are the risks of even conceding that in your mind? Oh, I think you're on mute, Erin.
And I think that there are a few things to say on this. So even if, we go along with the whole, you're only targeting a handful of trans athletes in the country, why are you spending time on this and wasting your money? And then even if like the premise of scholarships and making sure that trans people do have an opportunity to get these scholarships, because right now they're dramatically underrepresented, even if you don't buy these premises and you're like, maybe there are like some concerns about fairness or something like that. You then have to look at enforcement. And I often talk about this whenever I talk about how this affects cisgender people as well. And I think that it's really important, and I know that we're going to talk about other trans legislation, it's really important to talk about how all legislation that targets trans people ends up also affecting cis people. And so let me give you a really good example for why not to do this from another perspective. Utah, they passed their sports ban. And they made a panel of experts to essentially judge and adjudicate cases where somebody was thought to be trans. They paid this panel of experts, a few $1 million a year. Again, this is like a waste of money issue as well, because literally you're doing this for like 5 people, but we're going beyond that right now. What happened in Utah was essentially mothers of cisgender girls who lost to other cisgender girls made claims that those cisgender girls were trans. They launched big investigations that were held in secret. They went through these students' medical records. And like, even if you do want to put forward these bans, they're going to affect cis people too in terrible ways. And in fact, they often, and in the case, I believe in Utah and in other states, they often will affect intersectionally. So they will affect Black cisgender athletes more because of the fact that in some of these states, racial biases interact with expectations of gender and end up targeting cisgender people. Beyond that, we've tried sex testing in sports for years now. The Olympics attempted to essentially do what some of these states have codified into law in 1996, and they did a genome testing of all the athletes. And I think it was something like a dozen cisgender women were found to have XY chromosomes, and like an additional 7.
What was going on with Caster Semenya?
That's not how they discovered what was going on with Caster Semenya, but they dropped their chromosome testing in 1996 because they discovered that, oh God, we have all of these cisgender athletes that actually have XY, so we can't use chromosomes. Like that's not something that we can do. So what they did, actually, the reason why Caster Semenya is has all these issues with playing or not, is because now they've moved to a different way of doing sex testing in sports in the Olympics, and that's they use chromosome level. I mean, they use hormone levels, and the unfortunate side effect of that is that there are cisgender women that produce high amounts of testosterone for various reasons. They could be intersex. They could have medical conditions that cause extreme amounts of testosterone, and in fact, often many elite cisgender athletes have higher testosterone.
Yeah, that's what's so difficult about it, that so many folks that are operating at that level do have aberrant physical features.
It's all about
Michael Phelps. That's how you get to be an elite athlete. So what part of that is unfair? Is it unfair that Michael Phelps was born with the wingspan that he has and extra ribs or whatever it is that makes him so powerful? So I'm glad you brought up the Olympics, because I always looked at the Olympics as an example of how it did seem to me, and I don't know a ton about it, but it did seem to me that they had come up with some criteria that it seems are flawed, but tried to get at the issue of what kind of physically we're going to decide gives someone an unfair advantage, that steps away from this idea of either a total ban or a exclusion that's based on the fact of someone being trans. So the idea that if someone is transitioning and they, their hormone levels get to a certain place, then there is no more accusation. We're going to throw out any implication that they have an unfair competitive advantage because, there's been a widely agreed upon and predictable hormone limit, testosterone limit, estrogen limit, whatever it is, for them to compete. And that seemed to me to be almost freeing. Like, okay, we can stop talking about this. The Olympics figured this out. Why can't we just do what the Olympics has done? In the chips fall where they will may. This won't really implicate student athletes, really. Like, I mean, why is that not a reasonable solution if we want to kind of undermine the conversation, deflate the conversation, the energy behind the conversation around this particular issue that's sucking up so much attention in the country?
It's funny because you mentioned that they were flawed, and they are. And here's the problem. And I think that this actually gets to the whole point of trying to legislate this away. People are trying to legislate a gender binary that doesn't exist. And here's why this is an issue. So yeah, the Olympics came up with new ways of doing it. They used hormone levels. These new ways significantly harm cisgender women as well. Because what ends up happening now is that cis women who have high levels of testosterone are now forced to take hormone suppressants in order to compete. These are cis women that were born biologically female, quote unquote. I take issue with that term, but let's just say, they were assigned female at birth. And they're cisgender, and they have high rates of testosterone. And in order to compete, they have to suppress their own bodies. And so like there is no easy answer. That's what I'm trying to say here. There's actually no way of truly sort of policing the boundaries of gender through legislation. The Olympics has struggled with this for years.
I mean, the problem is that we do. The problem is that we, in the sports context, this is why sports is. We do police sex in sports. We already do. It's not like some of these other areas where, you can make an argument about this is a women's choir or a boys' choir or something like that. Where there's not this, the whole purpose of us, we have decided as a society, right or wrong, that men are stronger and faster. Cis men are stronger and faster than cis women. And for cis women to have an opportunity to compete in sports and enjoy the game and compete at a high level in college or beyond, you have to give them their own leagues where men aren't allowed, where cis men aren't allowed. And I think that part of what's going on with the sports stuff and what makes it difficult for folks is we've already made that decision as a society. And it was done in the interest of protecting the ability of cis women to do things that they otherwise weren't able to do or weren't afforded the opportunity to do in an earlier era. And that's why the tenor of this is so tricky. And I don't know what to do about that, beyond saying, oh, we don't care about sex segregated sports anymore. But that does raise some this is what the TERFs are so mad about,
Yeah. So like, and I think I'm trying to make sure that you're aware that I'm not faulting you for struggling with this, because here's the deal. Yes, we do attempt to police women's sports and gender in sports right now. But I will say that every single attempt that we have made, anything that you do in order to keep out transgender women, any test that you come up with will necessarily also eliminate cisgender women. And whenever cisgender women are eliminated, I often see, in my opinion, for reasons, but I often see people get very upset that, oh my God, a cisgender woman was just eliminated because of these sex testing characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that if you're asking me what I think the solution should be, I truly do think that good faith identification should be enough for transgender people to compete in sports. Good faith identification. And if somebody is in bad faith trying to compete, then you handle it. But as of right now,
well, who adjudicates that, Erin?
So obviously, if you see somebody who is very, very clearly doing some sort of fraudulent attempt at sports, I think that there are avenues that you can take to adjudicate that. Anybody is free to go to court and sue for fraud or something like that if there's a clear case. But the thing is that we're not seeing that. Like this is the reason I'm saying this, is that we are not actually seeing that happen. I can't think of a single case where a cisgender man has attempted to identify as a woman to win in sports or something like that. It hasn't happened.
I'm not here to weigh in on what is good faith or what is bad, but certainly people are making the accusation that folks like Leah Thomas.
I know Leah Thomas personally, and she is a wonderful woman, and if you ever get to know her, she is one of the sweetest souls that you will ever meet.
Yeah.
And B, I think that Leah Thomas, number one, given all of the things that she went through as an athlete, did so good in her competition. But number two, her record was just broken this year.
Yeah.
The one that they freaked out over and that they talked about, it was broken by another cisgender athlete.
Yeah, I really take that point. But is what we're saying that as long as the fastest female swimmer isn't a trans woman, it's okay?
I actually don't think that. I think that transgender women should be able to compete and win. And one of the biggest issues that we saw is that just because Leah Thomas won, people got mad. And
but there's a kind of contradiction there, right? Like you raise the fact that, well, how, the implication is how much could she have had a competitive advantage, Leah Thompson, if ultimately a cis woman beat her? Is it really about being trans or not? Is it if a cis woman beat her? How can we raise that as evidence that it's not an issue unless we're basically saying, as long as there is a cis person in the number one spot, a cis woman in the number one spot, that's what makes it okay. Do you know what I'm saying? And I'm not trying to argue against anything here. I'm just trying to, to point out that I think these are the tensions that make it a more difficult argument than some of these other kinds of arguments.
So I think the reason why I brought that up is because a lot of people used it as outrage bait. The fact that Leah Thomas was winning everything. And in the end, it's okay for transgender women to win in sports, but it's also okay to point out that transgender women as a whole are not dominating sports and forcing cisgender women out of them. And I think that's the point that I'm trying to make is
for sure.
Holistically, no, transgender women are not dominating. In fact, they are highly underrepresented. And I think just like circling back around, trans participation in sports is something that I would like to see celebrated and not demonized. And the idea that trans women are doing this because, or that the few trans athletes that are out there are doing this because they are trying to get ahead, trying to get some sort of an advantage, all of the struggles that come along with being trans in your day-to-day life, no cisgender person would do this. It's hard.
I largely credit that argument. I largely think that is true. I also think that as blessedly our society gets incrementally more open, that dynamic it could shift somewhat. I think that we have seen, if I just use, it's not a great analogy, it's not a perfect analogy, but there have been instance after instance of people who say that they're Native American on their college applications, who aren't, who Mindy Kaling's brother pretended to be Black on his college applications, even though he obviously isn't. There are people in a world where college is so expensive, opportunities are so limited, late stage capitalism, all of that, plus a world where it's still obviously very far from where we need to be, but is incrementally more open and accepting of trans people and other people in the LGBTQIA plus spectrum. I'm uncomfortable with the reasoning, the justification for not being concerned about it is being that most people aren't going to want to change their whole lives and their whole identity to do a charade just to get a scholarship. There has to be, I agree with you that it's unlikely to happen, but I do kind of want the reasoning to be based on something that is not so disaggregated from what people's concerns are, which is that, is there an acknowledgement fundamentally that we want, that there is a advantage that people who are assigned male at birth as a whole have against people who are assigned female at birth, and when it comes to physical competitions, and therefore there should be a space where people who are assigned women at birth can compete without having to be concerned about that disadvantage. I mean, I think that is the fundamental question. And that's not a leading question one way or the other, but that does seem to be something that needs to be resolved. Are we, should there be this is horrible, but like, if we, that's where we get into the place where people say, well, okay, fine. Would the issue be dropped if scholarships and all of those things were taken out of the equation? Because let's say there was a ban on trans women being eligible for them. At that point, what argument do anti-trans activists have left in this context? And I know that's like a big give.
I'm really glad that you used the example of like identification as Native American or something like that.
Yeah.
We don't then ban Native Americans from getting scholarships.
Well, I think the analogy there would be to ban cis women from getting scholarships, or Black people from getting scholarships.
Well, but here's what I'm saying is that just because somebody can self-identify as Native American on a form and then be considered for a scholarship doesn't mean that we're going to restrict Native Americans from applying for scholarships. It doesn't mean that we're going to put special tests to see how Native American you are.
Well, but that's the question, Erin. Should there be should you have to show your tribal identification or whatever other kind of certifications you have?
You don't have to. That's not something that you have to.
Well, yeah, but there's a question as to whether we should.
How about instead of Native American, let's go to Black then. Let's go to race. Should you have to submit some sort of a Blackness test Like
when I was applying to college, I don't know if they're still doing this, but you had to put a picture, you submitted a picture along with your application. And I'm not entirely sure it wasn't put this picture on there to prove what race you are, but I certainly suspect that there is some double checking to try to ensure that there's some kind of relationship between what you're claiming you are and what you actually are.
Right. And but again, are these formalized? Are these hormone levels? Or is this more done on vibes? It sounds like. And so again, applying it to trans people and trans people competing.
Yeah.
Why not apply the same standard?